ॐ ज्ञानतिमिरन्धस्य ज्ञानाञ्जनशलाकया चक्षुरोन्मिलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरुवे नमः। नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरयेत्। नष्टप्रायेषु भद्रेषु नित्यं भागवत सेवया भगवतीरुत्तमश्लोके भक्तिर्भवति नैष्टिकी। Hare Krishna. So we're reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 7, Chapter 6, entitled Prahlad Instructs His Demonic Schoolmates. It's a very wonderful chapter. And we're reading text 2 today. So I'll read the verse. Yata hi purushasyeha Vishnopādopasarpanam Yadesha sarvabhutanam priya atmeshwarah suhrit Yatha hi purushasyeha Vishnoho padopasarpanam Yadesha sarvabhutanam priya atmeshwarah suhrit Yatha hi purushasyeha Vishnoho padopasarpanam Yadesha sarvabhutanam priya atmeshwarah suhrit. Devotees can chant.
Yatahi purushasyeha Vishno paro pasarpanam Yad esha sarvabhutanam Briya atmeshvara suhrit.
Yatahi purushasyeha Vishnopādopasarpanam Yadesha sarvabhutanam priya atmeshvara suhrit.
Anybody else? Okay, we'll read the word for word translation. Yatha, in order that, he, indeed, Purushasya, of a living entity, Iha, here, Vishnoho, of Lord Vishnu, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Pada Upasarpanam, approaching the lotus feet, Yat, because, Eshaha, this, Sarva Bhutanam, of all living entities, Priyaha, the dear one, Atma Ishvaraha, the master of the soul, the super soul, Suhrit, the friend. And translation by and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. The human form of life affords one a chance to return home back to Godhead. Therefore, every living entity, especially in the human form of life, must engage in devotional service to the lotus feet of Lord Vishnu. This devotional service is natural because Lord Vishnu, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is the most beloved, the master of the soul, and the well-wisher of all other living beings. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. The Lord says in the Bhagavad Gita 5.29, the last verse in the Gita, in this chapter, Bhoktaram yajnatapasam sarvalokam heshwaram suhridam sarvabhutanam gyatva mam shantam richati. The sage who knows me as the ultimate purpose of all sacrifices and austerities, the supreme lord of all planets and demigods, and the benefactor and well-wisher of all living entities, attains peace from the pangs of material miseries. It is also called the peace verse, the peace formula verse. Simply by understanding these three facts, the Supreme Lord Vishnu is the proprietor of the entire creation, the first fact. Second, that he is the best well-wishing friend of all living entities, the second fact. And third, he is the supreme enjoyer of everything. One becomes peaceful and happy. For this transcendental happiness, the living entity has wandered throughout the universe in different forms of life and different planetary systems. But because he has forgotten his intimate relationship with Vishnu, he has merely suffered life after life. Therefore, the educational system in the human form of life should be so perfect that one will understand his intimate relationship with God or Vishnu. Every living entity has an intimate relationship with God. One should therefore glorify the Lord in the adoration of Shanta Rasa, or revive his eternal relationship with Vishnu as a servant in Dasya Rasa, a friend in Sakya Rasa, a parent in Vatsalya Rasa, or a conjugal lover in Madhurya Rasa. All these relationships are on the platform of love. Vishnu is a center of love for everyone, and therefore the duty of everyone is to engage in the loving service of the Lord. As stated by the Supreme Personality of Godhead in Srimad Bhagavatam 3:25 38. These are the instructions of Kapila Dev, this first chapter in that series of instructions. Yesha maham priya atmas sutasya sakha guru surudo daivam ishtam. So in any form of life, we are related with Vishnu, who is the most beloved, the super soul, son, friend, and guru. Our eternal relationship with God can be revived in the human form of life, and that should be the goal of education. So let me read that line again. It's such a critical line. Our eternal relationship with God can be revived in the human form of life, and that should be the goal of education. Indeed, that is the perfection of life and the perfection of education. So these two verses, 1 and 2, are very related. So I'll read the translation of 1 as well, and then the translation of 2, and maybe we'll discuss some points that are being made here. So translation for text 1, this is a very famous verse, the Kaumara Acharit Pragyo Dharman Bhagavatani. Nurlabam Manusham Janma Yadapya Dhrom Arthagam. So this verse translates as, Prahlad Maharaj said, one who is sufficiently intelligent should use the human form of the body from the very beginning of life. In other words, from the tender age of childhood, to practice the activities of devotional service, giving up all other engagements. The human body is most rarely achieved, and although temporary like other bodies, it is meaningful because in the human life, one can perform devotional service. Even a slight amount of sincere devotional service can give one complete perfection. And in text 2, the human form of life affords one a chance to return home back to Godhead. Therefore, every living entity, especially in the human form of life, must engage in devotional service to the lotus feet of Lord Vishnu. This devotional service is natural because Lord Vishnu, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is the most beloved master of the soul and the well-wisher of all other living beings. So there are 4 or 5 very specific points that are being made by Prahlad Maharaj in these 2 verses, and Srila Prabhupada elaborates on those points. And I will mention those points, and maybe we can discuss based on Srila Prabhupada's report what specifically we can learn. The first point is that this human form of life is very rare. It's rarely achieved. Now, we may not inherently understand that point because there are over 6 or 7 billion people on this planet. So we may wonder why this is the point. So we'll maybe discuss that for a few minutes. But the first point is that the human form of life is rare. It's rarely achieved. And the second point is that only in this human form of life can one actually perform devotional service. Only in this human form of life can you actually inquire, what is the purpose of my life? Why am I struggling like this? Animals generally don't have this question. They're only interested in how can they find their next meal and how can they find a mate and so on. And we know what Srila Prabhupada talks about, ahara, nitra, bhaya, maitana. We'll speak about that maybe a little bit. But the human form of life is the only form of life that can actually perform devotional service and inquire. And so the first point, like I said, is human form of life is very rare. Second is human form of life is the only form of life where you can actually inquire. Of course, there are exceptions that you read in the Srimad Bhagavatam and you read in the Chaitanya Charitamrita where the dog went back to Godhead. But those are exceptions. That's why they're in the Shastra. It's not common. It's not a common thing. So the human form of life is the only form of life that can actually inquire. And so The third point that's being made in these verses is that therefore every living entity, especially in the human form of life, must engage in devotional service. Right? So first is human form of life is rare. Second is human form of life is the only form of life that can actually inquire. Therefore, human form of life must engage in devotional service. And the fourth point is that this devotional service is not some artificial activity. It's natural. It's a natural engagement for a living entity. Jivera Swarupo hai Krishnera Nityadas. Kaviraj Goswami says in the Chaitanya Charitamrita that, and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is saying this, that is our natural state, to be connected with Krishna. To not be connected with Krishna and Bhakti is an unnatural state. So it's not, Srila Prabhupada so wonderfully says in that speech when he speaks about the holy name, he says, this is not an artificial imposition on the mind. The chanting of the holy name is not some artificial imposition on the mind. It's our natural connection with Krishna. That's the fourth point. And then the fifth point that is made in these verses and the purports is that the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, is the most beloved master of the soul. And he's the well-wisher of all living entities. He is Suhrit. He's the most well-wishing friend of all living entities. So maybe I'll touch on these 5 points that I'll just repeat them so that we can remember what they are. And this is essentially the essence of the teachings of Prahlad Maharaj in this whole chapter. Human form of life is rare. Human form of life is the only form of life that can practice bhakti, right? And the third is this process is natural. It's not an artificial thing. And we must engage in devotional service was the third point. The fourth point is it's a natural thing. And the fifth point is that the Supreme Lord is the dearmost well-wisher, right? So did we capture these 5 points is really what we have to think about as part of this discussion, right? So let me start with the first one just quickly. And what Srila Prabhupada is also saying in the purport that we know from other purports and other places where Srila Prabhupada has mentioned that there are 8.4 million species of life. And there are 400,000 species of human life alone. Now, all those species may not be currently prevalent or available or seen on this planet right now at this moment. But we're talking about entire creation, not just on planet Earth. So out of the 8.4 million species that the Shastra talks about, 400,000 species of humans alone. And if you look at just the sheer number of living entities on this planet, and nowadays all information is available on the internet or some of these AI tools, you can go and look at what is the ratio of humans to just insects. And it's 1:1 billion or something like that. It's some such ridiculous number. So we're definitely a huge minority. I'm not even talking about microbes and other sort of microscopic living entities, even just insects. The number of insects on this planet is way more than the number of humans, and by millions of times over. So just scientifically also, it is a fact that the human population is from a living entity's perspective, individual living entities, is a significant minority. And no other form of life, right? You don't see cats and dogs and other forms of life worried about what's the goal of my life? Why am I suffering like this? Right? An animal that's being led to slaughter. Srila Prabhupada speaks about this in his purports and his classes that one animal might be being led to slaughter, and the animal that's right behind will be looking for where can I eat some grass, not really understanding that he or she is next in line to be cut. Right? So that is the situation of animals. The consciousness is not so developed. But in the human form of life, we can actually start thinking about what is the objective of my life? Who am I? Who is God? Or is there a God? Who is God? And what is my connection with that God? Those are the fundamental questions that any intelligent human being should ask, which is kind of encapsulated in that Vedanta Sutra phrase, Athato Brahma Jigyasa. The spiritual life begins with the inquiry into the absolute. Right? That is the first step, right? Who am I? Why am I suffering like this? And is there a God? What is my connection with that God? And the human form of life is the only form of life that can actually make this inquiry. Right? And then the third point about that, once we have realized that this is a rare form of life, we have to utilize this form of life to perform devotional service. And this devotional service, the process of devotional service, and it'll come out from the subsequent verses as well, that there is no prerequisite. There's no pre-qualification needed. Anyone can perform this devotional service. And Srila Prabhupada so wonderfully says that in the same speech that I referred to earlier. He says, even a child can take part, or a dog can take part. Now, I'm sure all of you have heard that talk many, many times. And each time you hear it, it just goes to the core of your consciousness, where you understand Srila Prabhupada is appealing to us that we take this chanting of the holy name seriously, because it's the most sublime method for reviving our Krishna consciousness. And so simply hearing that one talk, 5-minute talk of Srila Prabhupada, it's so succinct and it's so clear, where he says, this is a sublime method for reviving Krishna consciousness, and anybody can take part. And in Shastra, you have so many examples. Prahlad Maharaj, we're speaking about Prahlad Maharaj. He was just a child. He was only 5 years old. So there was no age qualification. He was only a child. Dhruva Maharaj was only a child, 5 years old. Now you may say that, well, Prahlad Maharaj was the son of the ruler of the universe, and so was Dhruva Maharaj, son of Uttanapad. Well, there's other example of Narada Muni. He was the son of a maidservant. He did not even know who his father was. The mother didn't know who the father was. So she was not exactly in a very wonderful situation. She was a maidservant. She had a son. She didn't know who the father was. The child didn't know who the father was. So, and he was serving in that ashram. So clearly not highly educated, clearly not from high parentage or royalty or anything of that sort. Not a Brahman, high class Brahmana, nothing. So the examples are clearly showing that age is not a limitation, and education is not a limitation. Not very highly educated. Even previous activities are not a limitation. The Valmiki Ramayana, the whole story of how Ramayana was written by Valmiki. Valmiki was a hunter. He was a hunter, and his job was to hunt and also rob people who happened to pass by, and that's how he managed his existence. And when he met Narada Muni asked him, "Well, do you think what you're doing is right?" And so this hunter responded that, "Well, I'm doing it for my family, and so it is right." And Narada Muni said, "Well, do you think they will have a share, or they will take a share of the negative karma you receive?" And the response was, "Yes, of course, because I'm doing it for them." So Narada Muni asked him, "Why don't you go and ask them if they will?" And he did, and nobody in his family agreed. They said, "Well, it's your responsibility to care for us and feed us. So if you're performing sinful activities to do that, you're responsible for the reaction, not us." So this hunter came back to Narada Muni and said, "Well, everybody says that I'm responsible. So how do I transform myself?" And Narada Muni taught him to chant the holy name. So much so that this person was so sinful that he wasn't even able to chant the name of Rama. So Narada Muni told him to chant Mara. Mara in Sanskrit means death. Of course, this hunter was accustomed to either killing animals or people, so he was comfortable chanting Mara. And by constantly chanting Maram, 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 he started chanting Ram, Ram, and became completely purified. So even a sinful person like this hunter became Valmiki Muni. So there is no disqualification, either birth or parentage or prior activities or intelligence or skills. It's not like persons are highly skilled in giving lectures or quoting verses or any other visible service can perform bhakti. In fact, it is found that people who generally have a prominent service are struggling the most because they have false pride and all sorts of other things. And sometimes the devotees who have no prominent service, who have the most menial service, are the most advanced. So any kind of prominent service where you give in prominence becomes a huge detractor in our advancement, because that comes with recognition and false pride, and that becomes a huge problem in our bhakti. So the third point was that we have to perform bhakti, and this bhakti does not have any prerequisite or pre-qualification. Anyone can perform it. So the point is that there's no excuse for not doing it. There's no excuse for not doing it. We can't have any excuse for saying, well, I cannot perform bhakti. And I was just thinking about this point the other day when I was hearing one of the lectures, and we very often forget how fortunate we are. We always think about the shortcomings we have or the issues that we have in terms of, or impediments that we have in our material or spiritual life. But we don't really think about how fortunate we are. The fact that we're able to get up in the morning and we are conscious, that's a great blessing. Well, and then you're able to speak and chant the holy name. You're able to take darshan of the Lord in your home or in the temple, even if it's a picture or a deity. You're able to take darshan of the Lord. You have to take darshan of the spiritual master's picture. Think about the spiritual master. Think about the Lord. Able to take prasadam. Able to chant the holy name. These are all huge blessings. We don't really realize how fortunate we are. And most importantly, we all have been, especially everybody in this group, has been very, very fortunate to be connected to the parampara, the Srila Prabhupada, right? And I heard from one of the disciples of Srila Prabhupada one time when I was the only time I visited Mayapur, I met this Mataji, and she's a Prabhupada disciple, and I was telling her how fortunate I feel to have met her and get a darshan. And she said, so she said something. I told her that it's such a great fortune to meet somebody who's actually physically met Prabhupada. And so she told me something which was very striking. She said, well, why do you speak about Srila Prabhupada as if it's in the past? Srila Prabhupada is still here. And you're connected with him directly. He's still here. It's not something in the past. And the second point she told me is that, and you're more fortunate because the grandfather is more affectionate to his grandchildren than to his children. So as grand disciples of Srila Prabhupada, we are way more fortunate in one sense, because the mercy of the grandfather flows without any impediments to the grandchildren. So we are so, so fortunate. And so when you think about these things, we should feel so blissful that we receive so much good fortune, and we're actually in great shape so we can actually practice bhakti. So there's no impediments to practicing bhakti. And I'm telling myself this, that, next time I think about why it's hard to practice bhakti, you got to remember that we have the ability, we've been given the ability, we've been given connection to the parampara, we've been given the mercy. So now the ball's completely in our court. Right? We've been given a nice plate of prasadam all fully made. You don't have to stand in line. Somebody came and gave you a plate of prasadam. All you have to do is eat it. So it's like that. We've been given this ability to perform bhakti on a platter. Now we have to just perform it. And then the fourth point that is coming out in these verses is that this devotional service is natural. Because our eternal connection with Krishna is there. It's not something that we have to somehow create or develop. We may have turned our face, but Krishna has never turned his face from us. Right? So, and I was thinking about this point, and I was hearing my spiritual master also speak about this point. The acharyas, they have no doubt about Krishna's love for us. The only thing they focus on is, can we actually reciprocate with Krishna? Right? But as sadhakas, sometimes we need to get reinforced that actually Krishna loves us. So we are very, very interested in stories like Sudama, where Krishna reciprocated with Sudama and so on, because we want to continue to build our faith that actually Krishna loves us. But when you look at what the acharyas talk about, for them that is a given. They're not confused about that point at all. They're 100% convinced that Krishna loves us. So the only focus they have is, how can I reciprocate? The question is not whether or not Krishna loves us. The question is only, how can I reciprocate with Krishna's love? So this connection with Krishna is natural. And I was hearing this one talk, I forget who was speaking this, somebody in our parampara, and he made a very striking point, which stuck with me when he was saying that the objective of human life is to be extremely selfish. It's a provocative point, right? So, and what does that mean? Being selfish means being only focused on your self-interest. And the highest self-interest is to connect yourself with Krishna. That is your highest self-interest. So if a person is extremely selfish, in the true sense, they'll be the greatest devotee, because they will understand that the only self-interest you have is to connect with Krishna. Everything else that we consider our self-interest is actually contrary to our self-interest. A person may be enjoying sense gratification thinking that is my self-interest, but actually they're working against their self-interest. It's like a person who is forbidden a certain food, right? Because it's really bad for their health, or they are in a very precarious situation. If they go and partake in that food, they may think they're engaging in their self-interest, but actually they're working against their self-interest, because that's going to put them in a very bad situation from a health perspective. And similarly, any activities which are contrary to bhakti are not in our self-interest. So the point that devotee was making is that if you're really selfish and you're really intelligent, then the conclusion will be that you will practice bhakti. So this idea that Supreme Lord's devotional service is a natural thing, we have to understand. It's not something that we have to artificially cultivate. It is our natural state. And the final point is that the Supreme Lord is our dearmost well-wishing friend. Suhrit. I'll just speak about this one word, Suhrit. This comes in many places in the Bhagavatam and the Gita as well. Most importantly, in this fifth chapter, where Krishna says, Suhridam sarvabhutanam gyatva mam shantam richati. Suhridam. So Srila Prabhupada translates it as well-wisher of other living beings. And Srila Prabhupada also talks about the meaning of this word Suhrit. So in Sanskrit, there are many words for friend. Many different words, almost a dozen different words, based on the context. Now, this maybe touch on two or three of them. So one word is mitra. Mitra typically means official friend. Like you may meet people just, let's say, at work or at some other, and they're your friend. So you know their name, they know your name, and you greet each other, Hare Krishna Prabhu, and so on. But it's an official friendship. Right? Interestingly, actually, even the sun god Surya is called Mitra, because the sun is the friend of all living entities, and without discrimination, he supplies light and also rain, because of the sun we have rain. Right? So another name for sun is Mitra. There's also another word for friend in Sanskrit called Sakha. The Sakhas of Krishna and so on. Sakhas are more intimate than a Mitra. where you may also have some loving exchanges with sakhas. You may play with them, right? So you may meet somebody officially at work, but then if you let's say get together and play basketball twice a week with set of people, then they become your sakhas as well. There's a little more intimacy, right? You may still not share your heart with a sakha, but there's more intimacy than just a mitra. Then there's bandhu, which is also a friend, and there's more intimacy. There's more. Bandhana means to connect or tie. So even family members are called bandhava because they're tied to you in family relationships. So bandhu is slightly more intimate than a sakha. But suhrit means one who's connected with your heart. Your hearts are connected, which means that you're able to share your heart without fear of embarrassment or anything else. So Krishna is in the category of suhrit, and the greatest suhrit, meaning that he's the dearmost well-wishing friend. So these 5 points I just wanted to quickly point out may not be so obvious from the words, but this is really what Prahlad Maharaj is talking about, right? First of all, human life is super rare. We have to recognize that we've been given human birth. And secondly, only in this human form of life can we actually practice bhakti. The thirdly, therefore, we should actually practice bhakti. And fourth, why we should practice bhakti? Because Krishna is it's a natural process. It's not an artificial process. And lastly, and he's the dearmost friend for us, dearmost well-wishing friend for us. So there's nobody else who can surpass Krishna in being our well-wisher. And that is what Srila Prabhupada taught us, right? And he would always sign his letters saying, "Your ever well-wisher," because Srila Prabhupada, his only business was to connect us with Krishna. And nobody other than the person whose only thought is to connect you to Krishna can be a well-wisher. And that's the point we gather. So anyway, I made a lot of points, more than I usually do in a short discussion. But this is a very power-packed section, and these two verses deliver a lot of these messages. So I just wanted to share how I've kind of understood these chapters and these verses and the specific points. The whole chapter, the next chapter, will elaborate on these points. So you'll hear about the same concepts again and again as part of the discussion on this chapter. How do we utilize human life and so on. So that's a few points on the verse. Thank you. Hare Krishna. If any comments, questions, or anything else, we can do that for a few minutes. Anything from anybody like to add or ask?
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna.
Thank you very much, Prabhu, for an enlightening class. So I watched the Bhagavatam single movie, and like now I'm just fully convinced. Now is the time. It's like just by Prahlad Maharaj's teachings. So my question doesn't relate specifically to Prahlad Maharaj's teachings, but just like my own application and some of the blockers. So one blocker I'm currently experiencing is just the difficulty of maintaining flow with online work. So I've seen like I thrive. My personality type is that I like need in-person association to basically reflect back uh, my work, the value that I'm trying to like generate. So in you're very experienced just performer of action in Krishna consciousness. So how does somebody, like, what resources, what can I do to like just try to maintain flow in my work, and just the struggle of working remotely and talking to people, having colleagues that I've never met physically. It's all online, and I'm working with artificial intelligence, and um, I know that this isn't real, So there's just some dissonance that I'm just struggling with, between what is real, what is not, what is of value, what is not, and how do I like continue to work. Just like we see with Prahlad Maharaj, he was able to maintain his Krishna consciousness despite being born in a demoniac family, despite all the association. So my question just relates to this. I just want to be able to remove this blocker so that I can continue to progress.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, on the work side, maybe we can just discuss offline. I can maybe help you offline. We can talk offline, but I'll address the one part of your question, which is specific to association. And so, especially in this day and age, I think the meaning of association has changed quite a bit. Uh, uh, so, 100 years ago, association, even like 50 or 30, 40 years ago, association meant that you would have to physically be with the person to hear from that person. And when telephone was invented, then you could talk to a person or hear. So even before, uh, like in the time of Lord Chaitanya, if you wanted to pass a message 500 years ago, somebody would write a message, and then it could be days before the message even got to you, right? So essentially association was only in person. When telephone came, then you could essentially talk to people on the phone and still have some association. And now with uh, live video like we're doing right now, this is Sangha. This is really Sangha. We are not physically together, but what does being together mean? Being together means really being together in purpose. What is the purpose, and what is the purpose for which we're associating? So we're together in the purpose that we want to serve Srimad Bhagavatam and become more focused in our spiritual life. So virtual Sangha, especially when COVID happened, that became the only mechanism for us to get any Sangha. Right? That was 3 years ago. It seems like an eternity ago, but it was just 3 years ago that COVID, at 3 or 4 years ago, COVID ended, right? So uh, that became the primary mechanism for us to get Sangha. Even devotees with spiritual master and other senior devotees, the only way we could hear live Srimad Bhagavatam or any lectures was through this kind of online mechanism. So the humanity is adapted to considering even virtual Sangha as Sangha, and that is okay. Although we should definitely seek out personal association and seva, right? But we cannot feed somebody prasad virtually, right? We cannot cook lovingly and feed somebody virtually. You cannot. So those things you still need to do, because that kind of seva is still. So I wouldn't minimize the value of personally performing physical service to Vaishnavas, because that is still our primary method of reciprocation. But when it's not always possible all the time, we should still take advantage of any other virtual sangha we can get. That's the first point. And the second point is, and this is something that as we become more and more focused in our devotional service, and as we become more and more experienced in devotional service, and as the years pass on, if your devotional service is dependent on getting recognition or reciprocation from your spiritual master or other senior devotees that yes, you're doing such a great job, then at some point we will hit a wall. Right? We should not be only performing spiritual life because someone is appreciating what we're doing. In the beginning of our spiritual life, that's really what takes us forward. Right? Even a little bit of service gets appreciated, gets recognized, and then we feel motivated to do more. But as we become more and more experienced in our spiritual life, the practice of spiritual life cannot be dependent on somebody recognizing our progress, cannot be dependent on somebody appreciating our progress. cannot be dependent on positive reinforcement from our spiritual master, right? Because if that's the only reason why we're progressing in spiritual life, we will hit a wall. So as a beginner, we're all beginners in one sense, but since we've been practicing for many years, I can say when you come to Krishna consciousness and in your first month, first year, everything is so new, everything is so exciting, and everything that you do, you get so much appreciation from other senior Vaishnavas, and you feel very, very enlivened. But if you spend 10, 15 years, then 20 years, 30 years, then you're not getting appreciated by others on a daily basis. You don't get appreciated right after you finish your 16 rounds, saying, "Oh, Prabhu, that was so wonderful, you finished 16 rounds." Right? Nobody comes and tells you that. Right? Nobody comes and tells you, "Oh, Prabhu, I'm so inspired by your Vaishnava qualities." It may happen once in a while on your birthday or something people might wish you, but it's not the constant thing. So the motivation to perform bhakti has to come from the inside. Because we realize this is our highest self-interest. And this gives us joy. We're not performing bhakti to get appreciation from others. We're performing bhakti because that is what we need to do. We're not chanting our 16 rounds because somebody has to come and pat us on the back. We're chanting our 16 rounds because that is what gives us joy. So once we get to that kind of consciousness where we are focusing on spiritual life, not because somebody externally has to appreciate us, but we internally have to feel the joy, that's when we start really practicing bhakti. So the externals kind of are not the focus, and the internals become the focus, right? And this is a subtle change that needs to happen at some point in a devotee's life. Otherwise, you're always stuck in a point where anytime you have like, of course, again, I'm not going to speak about disputes, but every time you have a situation where you're somehow unhappy in a specific relationship with other devotees or a situation, then you start questioning your bhakti. But bhakti's got nothing to do with any of that. Bhakti is between you and Krishna. So because you are unhappy about a circumstance or a situation or another devotee, why is that impacting your relationship with Krishna, who is your well-wishing, dearest, most well-wishing friend anyway? There's a lack of understanding, there's a lack of connection, right? So your connection is with Krishna, but then you have a problem with the material situation, and so the first thing that's impacted is your relationship with Krishna. That shows a lack of maturity in bhakti. So the internal focus I'm talking about is when we understand the purpose is to connect with Krishna. And these circumstances that are materially around us may be good or may not be good. Right? So, and this is not some kind of detailed point. It's a very fundamental point that Krishna makes in the second chapter of the Gita, text 14. Tan titikshasva bharata, tolerate. So he doesn't tell this point to Arjun at the very end of the Gita. He tells him at the very beginning, tolerate. So all these material circumstances we tolerate because we realize that ultimate point is to connect with Krishna. Anyway, I kind of walked around your question, but the fundamental point is that we cannot be dependent on reciprocation or appreciation in the material sphere to continue our bhakti. And same thing applies in the work as well. That we understand what the focus is and we focus there. I don't know if that answers your question. I'm happy to speak offline as well because there are other aspects of your question which are not specific to Bhagavatam, so I can help in other areas as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. Yeah, that's very, you just hit the nail on the head with that. Yeah, and I'll connect with you offline. Thank you so much.
Anything else before we wrap? Okay, if there's nothing else, then thank you. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Oh.